Welcome to the EcoParent podcast network. I'm Sam, the founder of EcoParent magazine. My partner Alexis and I had zero experience in the publishing industry, no money, and a new baby. But we quit our jobs, leapt into the unknown, and started EcoParent magazine anyway. It was absolutely freaking terrifying. But at the same time, it felt right. Just a few years into the journey, Alexis was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer that later found its way to her brain. It was utter chaos, navigating treatment schedules, caring for a 3-year-old, and trying to run a fledgling business, not to mention the general emotional havoc. Alexis didn't make it, but the rest of us did, and I've spent the years since raising a wonderful son and building EcoParent into North America's top print magazine for conscientious families. Even 10 years in, we're still a very small crew. If you send an email, it's probably me that will answer you. And this podcast network is a monumental step for us, another leap into the unknown. But like before, it just feels right. And I know that Alexis would agree that the podcasting team I've assembled here is an incredible group of people whose only goal is to inspire the best in you. Okay, I'm going to shut up now and let you listen to the podcast. Thank you so much for stopping by. You're the reason we do what we do.
It's wonderful to see kids playing outside using their bodies. It just allows them to be so much more creative and imaginative because nature isn't always structured with lines like on a playground.
Today on the podcast, I am incredibly excited to speak with Eileen Tran. Eileen is an outdoor educator, a lover of nature, and we have a wonderful conversation about all of the gifts that getting your kids outside can give, from promoting a healthy immune system to encouraging physical activity to developing an appreciation and a love for the natural world, which leads to stewardship and a better environment for all of us, to a really fascinating way in which spending time outside promotes healthy risk assessment and decision-making and relationship building. Things you never knew you never knew. So I'm here with Eileen Tran. Hi, Eileen. How are you today?
Hi, Leslie. Thanks for having me today.
As you know, our intended point of discussion today is getting kids outdoors. And that's certainly something that's close to my heart as a parent and as a naturopathic doctor. But I gather it's close to yours too, given your professional pursuits.
For sure. Being outside has always been a thing I loved growing up, but never actually had access to it in terms of community. And it wasn't until I discovered after Teachers College that there are places in Toronto that you can enjoy being outside, learning about nature with other people, with other mentors. It just opened my eyes to a whole new world of enhancing my own learning and sharing that with other kids and how to be outside and learning and growing in exciting and inspiring ways.
And so you're speaking, I asked you the question, you're speaking about your experience personally and what you love about being outdoors. Maybe can you tell us a little bit about how that manifests for you now? So you work for the Pine Project and for Tamarack, is that right?
So in 2012, I started volunteering with the Pine Project. I was so excited to find out that there's actually a place that was involved with wilderness survival skills, which is what I was really interested in that time. I've held various roles with them, from volunteer, lead instructor, camp counselor, camp director, and now I'm their equipment manager. And also with Tamarack West Outdoor School, I started teaching with them as a teacher in 2015, and now I'm also their vice principal. It's amazing.
You know, it's interesting. I'm just finishing up a project with some students that were looking at various research studies about the impact of nature-based education or outdoor educational models to children's health and well-being. There are lots of things that different projects identified as being helpful to kids, both from increase in their physical movement over the course of a day to better cognition or ability to think, to risk assessment, to emotional intelligence and the ability to discern what other people are feeling. That was all from a theoretical perspective. It certainly convinces me that doing education with kids outside is valuable. I'm curious if you can speak a little bit about what you've observed.
Yeah, so everything you said, based on my experiences, is all true. Just the transformation that I've seen in kids, something that, from a short-term perspective, something that parents have come back to me to say time and time again, is that their child is so much more alive and happier and excited to go to school. It's more experiential. It's just so much more exciting and inspiring. And what you're learning during the day feels really authentic and meaningful because it's just triggering all your senses. And it feels like you're just learning as things are happening because nature's changing all the time. And so you're paying attention to what's happening and you want to learn more about it. It's just so exciting. And another big effect I found from being outside is risk management. So I noticed that when kids are outside, they become a lot more aware because you need to, because you have to learn about what the hazards are outside in order to be safe, to take care of yourself. And by knowing what the hazards are and knowing what risks could be out there and how to be safe around those risks, overall, you're just more aware and you become more responsible. You become a better critical thinker. And I see that just all throughout the years, even when they come back as staff.
Oh, I love that. I love that. There's such an epidemic in our modern parenting culture of this so-called helicopter parenting. I see this as a parent myself. There's a lot of talk in the media and social media about the risks facing our children, and the knee-jerk reaction from a lot of parents, I think, is to protect them and to prevent them from engaging in risky activities out of fear. We know, of course, that the things that parents are most afraid of, things like abduction, things like, injuries. Yes, well, injuries definitely are something we need to be mindful of. And I'd love to hear you speak about that in an outdoor setting. The research tells us time and time again that kids do better and they're safer when they're given those opportunities to take calculated risks within safe parameters. I often talk a lot in parenting about sort of firm and loving boundaries, that our job as parents and caregivers is to create appropriate boundaries around the individual child, and that depends on the values of the family. It depends on the temperament of the child, their skill set, all of those sorts of things. But then they need to be able to take risks within those boundaries. And so that's really fascinating to me to hear you talk about your observation of kids through the years and watching them develop that ability to assess risk.
Having a mentor is so key in that, because then children, they know how to be safe around those risks. Like climbing a tree, for example, it's like so exciting to do. And having a mentor there just to guide kids on how to climb a tree safely makes it a lot safer to do than if you go into it not knowing how to be safe, like knowing to use at least 3 points of contact or more while climbing a tree.
That's a great tip.
Yeah, 3 points of contact at least. Knowing the difference between a live tree and a dead tree. So showing them how to identify the difference between the two. Like, is there bark or no bark? Are there leaves, no leaves? How thick are the branches that you're going to use to climb? Do you want to grab towards the end of the branch, like the tip of the branch, or do you want to go close to the trunk of the tree? Where does it feel more sturdy? Where do you want to depend your life on when you're climbing on the tree? And also climbing no higher than 2 of you, for example. So setting those boundaries and then allowing children to explore those boundaries in a safe way now that they have the tools and the knowledge on how to do it safely. And it's just great to see. I've seen 5-year-olds accomplish like 2 feet of climbing, and they'll just do that same 2 feet over and over again, because you can see how good they feel about themselves, just being able to climb those 2 feet.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And I'm curious if you are able to make any observations about, I mean, it's one thing to feel confident climbing a tree and maybe building a fire or water play, those kinds of things. Have you seen that translate into the human built world? So do kids who have the opportunity to take risks in a natural setting and develop those attributes, are they able to transfer that into their interactions with people or in their decisions around social media, let's say? Or I'm curious, maybe you have, maybe you haven't.
I would hope so, that it would transfer. So being outside with kids in nature, you're always mentoring kids how to do things safely. From the littlest things like how to carve, for example, to bigger things like how do we approach this river, like huge hazard. The way I've seen this transformed is, for example, there is a day at school where we're going to go on a field trip. And sometimes we have students visiting for a trial day. And in the morning we meet outside in a green space. And sometimes in the winter in a field, there could be puddles of frozen water, which has turned into ice. So that is already a natural inspiration for kids to want to go to, because ice can be so much fun, slipping and sliding. It's just a magnet for children to go towards. So today we're with 10-year-olds today. When it comes to ice by a body of water, that's always a clear no. But what about if there's ice in the middle of a grassy field in the winter? That could be potential for fun, but it can also be potential for not so much fun. Like anything in nature, things can be a hazard and things can be helpful or fun. And so when it came to this patch of ice on this morning, the kids who have been with us for quite some time, they knew that, okay, let's take a pause before we just go tromping on this ice. You could see them pausing at the edge. But then the kids who are on the trial day who are just visiting us and haven't been like in nature, they go running on the ice and tromping on it, no matter how many times I question, like, do you think that could be a good idea? What do you think? How do you know if the ice is thick enough or thin enough? No matter how much questioning you provide beforehand to try to guide them through those questions, they were just too excited. I think their excitement of seeing ice just pulled them on. And then, of course, the ice was too thin because we didn't get to test it the way we would usually do, and their feet got wet. And so that was such a big difference to see how people who have been mentored outside for some time approach a potential risk compared to children who haven't been mentored around hazards outside, how they kind of go right into it without really thinking about what risks there could be.
That's a great example. And what really strikes me about how you told that story was that the kids who are accustomed to the process that's used in terms of risk assessment, probably asking themselves the questions that they're used to hearing you ask, versus a child who perhaps hasn't been mentored in that process of critical thinking, rhetorical questioning. And it sounds to me like your approach to that risk management is to, as we said, create reasonable boundaries. So there were some non-negotiables. We never go on ice on a body of water. And then around the potential risks that could be negotiated, they're accustomed now to asking themselves those sorts of questions. So it's not just a no, you can't, end of story, but there's a learning process around what questions should be asked. What is the potential risk here? What are the consequences? And then could I even venture to say, am I willing to live with those consequences? So if getting my boots wet is the worst that's going to happen, maybe I'm willing to take that risk as opposed to falling through the ice into a lake. So I'm curious, I mean, with both the Pine Project and Tamarack, so you have people trained in childhood education, presumably, whether formally or informally, doing that mentorship structure you've mentioned a few times as being very important. Not every child will have the opportunity to go to an outdoor school or an outdoor program. I'm wondering if you're able to speak at all about how parents whose kids or grandparents whose kids go to a quote unquote regular school could access and utilize some of the strategies to encourage their kids to be outside more, to gain some of the benefits that you're talking about.
What I would love to say to all those families is trust that your child is capable, whether they're 4 years old or 12 years old. Trust that they have the ability to learn how to be safe and to learn how to identify things that are unsafe. Just trust that they can do that, and then give them the tools and knowledge to be able to practice those things. For example, in winter it could be very cold. And sometimes a guardian or parent might say, zip your coat back on, put your coat back on. But something I like to ask is, if a child asks, can I take off my coat in the winter? I'll always respond with, as long as you're taking care of your body. If you become cold, what can you do? Then they'll say, I'll put it back on. It's like, great. If you become too hot, what can you do? And then they said, I can unzip it, or I can take it off. So just going through that questioning with them and knowing that they can decide and be aware of what body temperature they're feeling, and that they can adjust to that appropriately, instead of just always telling them, put your coat back on, zip it up, put your hat on. Really just empowering them with the practice of self-awareness of how they're feeling and doing what feels good for them in that moment. So that's one, is just trusting that they can be capable and giving them the knowledge and tools on how to take care of themselves. Another thing I would love to share is to just show curiosity about the world, about things in nature. It could just be the littlest plants on the sidewalk, the tiniest creatures on the window. It could be, I wonder what direction the wind is coming from today, or what was that sound that we just heard? Do you think it was a bird? Do you think it was a creature? Just asking questions and showing curiosity. There's never pressure to know everything or to have the answers. It's really just inspiring that curiosity, which helps to foster awareness about all sorts of things around you. Modeling positivity and gratitude in all weather, rain or shine, because we're not always going to have sunny days. And it's great to be able to feel positive, no matter if it's sunny or rainy or snowy. And I feel like having that attitude of gratitude and positivity, no matter what the weather, can really foster appreciation for nature. Another one, I think, is picking up on your child's inspiration, whether they're a young child or a teenager, trying to pay attention to see what kind of things in nature or outside piques their interest, and go with that. Like, just take that inspiration as far as you can. If you have a magnifying glass, take that out with your kids. And as they grow older, pay attention to maybe other things they could be interested in. It could be plants, it could be birds, it could be using tools. As they get into those older ages, using their hands and feeling competent around tool use, I also find is a really big thing.
That was so much. All of the things that you just described have many other, I truly think that nature and nature itself has value, period. And all the things that you just talked about, all the strategies that you recommended that parents engage in, to me are so transferable to other parts of our lives. So I just want to pick up on a couple of the things that I heard in that. And one of the things that I feel very strongly about is promoting healthy sexuality in kids. And when you were talking about asking questions, kids want to take off their jacket. A lot of parents and adults will say, oh, no, it's too cold, you've got to keep it on. It's telling kids, it's kind of gaslighting them that they don't know what they feel and what feels good and what doesn't feel good. And I get a lot of parents asking me about how to promote a healthy sense of one's sexuality in their children. And to me, it comes from having those kinds of conversations about sensation early on, not about sex specifically, but just about sensual experience. If you're cold, you do something about that. If you're hot, you do something about that. If something doesn't feel good, you speak up and you identify what you can do to make yourself feel better.
We know there's a lot to consider when it comes to you and your family's health, but Orange Naturals can make things easier. We make high-quality supplements designed by naturopathic doctors right here in Canada. Whether you're dealing with picky eaters, navigating your personal health, or just trying to round out your family's nutrition, we've got you covered. Browse our full selection of supplements, probiotics, kids products, and more at orangenaturals.com, or look for us at your local health food store. Natural medicine made simple.
I also feel very passionately about planetary health and the health of our environment, and the way that the health of the environment affects different people in different places. So when you were talking about that curiosity, when we live in a built environment, there's such a tendency to be uncomfortable at the idea of a spider in our house, as opposed to being curious and grateful for those spiders because of the wonderful role they play in terms of our living space. And so I believe in my bones, and I've certainly read some research around the idea that when we spend time in a natural setting, and kids specifically, they are more inclined to engage in environmental stewardship and to advocate not only for themselves, but for other beings and for the natural world. So it was a very leading question, but I'm just curious if you've noticed that.
I've definitely seen kids become so empathetic as a result of being outside in nature and being curious about creatures. And a big part of being in nature is a chance to observe it. It makes a really big impact because it's no longer just this thing you don't know. It's like now something you understand more about, and you can see that they can have emotions. Like an animal can feel scared, even watching ducks playing, for example, or an ant stumble on its own feet. Like just noticing kind of human qualities and taking the time to observe these things throughout your childhood. You really learn how to be empathetic towards things people normally just want to not have around. One example is around snakes. So like a sense of fear was never instilled upon these group of kids because they've been outside of nature for so long. And so they were so comfortable with the idea of snakes, or at least they didn't put a wall against themselves and the snake. At least they were open to interacting with snakes. And some of these kids were so comfortable with snakes that not only were they able to pet the snake, hold the snake, they allowed the snake to just crawl on them. And it was just amazing to see how comfortable these kids were with the snake, but instead they just felt compassion and empathy for other living things. Even with plants, some plants people consider weeds or pests, but sometimes they just might be unwanted in a specific space. If your connection with a plant is very positive, then that's the relationship you'll have with that plant. But if from the get-go, the way you're introduced to a plant is in a negative way, then your impression of that plant from then on would be a negative impression. Just having a connection with plants and animals creates such empathy because you know more about it. You know how it can positively impact the environment around them.
Amazing. And what you're saying also makes me think of is often what a lot of the research says about environmental stewardship is when humans see themselves as above or more important than the rest of the beings on the planet. When we view the planet and the animals and the plants and the fish and the air and the rocks and the water as being for our use as a resource, then we're less inclined to care for it, except in the manner of, sustainably, like not over harvesting so that we've got some in the future kind of thing. And even then we don't do that often. So it's really interesting to me to think about whether seeing an animal or a plant in its own right and its place in that environment, its place in that particular setting, its role in that ecosystem, of which we are also a part, as opposed to the way in which it serves us or inconveniences us. So I think about nettles. Nettles are one of my favorite plants that a lot of people don't like because they sting. And they are really powerful medicine on a lot of levels. They're very nutritious. And the reason they're so nutritious is because they're very, very good at drawing minerals up out of the soil. And so when we eat them, they're very mineral rich as a salad, as a steamed nettles, green side dish kind of thing. When we make them into a tea, they're really potent. Yet we tend to sort of avoid them because they're prickly. And that to me is brilliant. I mean, all of the ways in which plants and creatures have also evolved attributes and strategies to be alive and to thrive and to interact. It just is absolutely remarkable to me. So as much as I love your reflection on the development of skills of empathy in terms of getting to know the plants and getting to know the animals and being curious about them and observing them and picking up on their cues and all of those wonderful things as a vehicle to caring for them because of their own inherent value and worth is just such a beautiful thing to me. I think that's absolutely critical in terms of our understanding of how we might possibly mitigate the worst of the climate disaster.
Yeah, so the spending, and it's all because of spending time with nature that enables them to develop this empathy towards it, because you no longer see it as as a thing you don't know. When you spend so much time with the same, for example, the same cedar, like the same type of tree, like cedar, for example, when you've interacted with it all throughout the years, like making tea or carving the wood, it's all relationship building, and so they're not strangers anymore. When you see them in the park, it's like you know them. And so I definitely see that staying with kids into their adulthood. So at least when they have to make decisions about what happens to the planet, they'll think about like the cedar that they grew up with.
That is so moving to me. It's a couple more things I want to ask about. One is movement. So I know from the research and from what I experience in my own life and what I see amongst the children that I've been fortunate to share space with, people and children are more likely to move their bodies, to be more physically active when they spend time outside. It's also a very different kind of movement. So it's one thing to say, run outside instead of running on a treadmill, although there's lots of good reasons for that in terms of, proprioception and the way that a foot can kind of, develop its sense of balance, and certainly the exposure to sun and benefits in terms of vitamin D, but also the nature of the movement is different. It's less structured. I'm wondering if you can speak at all to that. I mean, as a teacher, I'm sure you've had the opportunity to see kids at recess playing a structured game of soccer versus just free play.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see kids playing outside using their bodies. It just allows them to be so much more creative and imaginative, because nature isn't always structured with like lines like on a playground. For example, when you're climbing a tree, not all trees are the same. So you have to really be creative with where you place your hands and feet, 3 points of contact. Logs, boulders, rocks, even like tree roots, it's just all uneven. So you're constantly having to be aware of what's around you and where you're placing your body. And just imagine if a child is outside in that environment, playing in that environment all the time, how comfortable they are with their body and how confident they can feel crawling under logs or going through hedges. And then I really feel like that transfers into how you think in your mind, just like being a lot more open to thoughts and like how you can see things and how you can move. That's just very clear to me that kids outside, they are a lot more imaginative and creative because they're just exposed to so many different environments that they have to move their body through, as opposed to like in a classroom, for example. It doesn't offer as much variety.
Yeah, so a lot of problem solving necessary for that. And it also makes me think that they get really, really dirty. So I've always been okay with my kids getting dirty. I'm still okay with dirt. I think it's actually really important for hygiene. But we know, and I speak about this on other episodes, that kids do need to be exposed to the potential infectious agents in the world around them in order to develop a optimally functioning immune system. So to reduce the likelihood of developing allergies and to make sure their immune systems are competent. It strikes me that with all of that creative movement and crawling under logs and slipping through thin ice and getting their boots wet and climbing trees with 3 points of contact always, there's a lot of dirtiness. And so what would you say to a parent who is very uncomfortable with their kids coming home filthy?
I think they have to think about like the trade-off between if they would like their child to just feel so comfortable in nature, getting dirty and just excited by life. Is that okay versus like having to deal with the muddy clothes after? Like what is worth it?
That's a really, really great, concise tip, because I think as a parent, that's often what we do as a trade-off. Which do I prefer in this particular situation? So yeah, getting comfortable with dirt and possibly celebrating it. The last piece I'd love to talk about, and it's sort of a biggish topic, and I'll try to set it up with a few different things that I'm aware of from again, the research. So very recently, somebody proposed to me the idea. We know that if we look at populations, that people who are assigned female at birth tend to have a higher risk of allergies than children who are assigned male at birth. And the question around those sort of gender differences is always, is that biological? Is that hormonal? Like what, or is it social? And the idea that was proposed was that kids who are female are socialized in a different way, are less encouraged to rough and tumble, less encouraged to get dirty, less encouraged to climb trees. And maybe that's actually the mechanism by which some studies have shown that children who are assigned female at birth are more likely or higher risk of developing allergies because they're less permitted in their upbringing to get dirty and to be exposed to it. So that's one piece. And then the other, big social construct that's relevant, I think, is race. The comfort with which people who are Black or Indigenous or otherwise people of color feel welcome in a natural setting or are encouraged to explore natural settings. So I'm just curious, you are a woman and a person of color. Can you speak a little bit to that in terms of your own experience, if you like, or observations that you've made?
Yeah, sure. So I identify as Vietnamese Canadian. Both my parents are immigrants from Vietnam. I go by pronouns she, her, they, them. Definitely, ever since I've been involved with the nature community, I've always felt welcomed by everyone. Something I did notice growing up, though, was the lack of, exposure to a nature community. Like I didn't even know that there were communities out there that were involved with nature connection until well into my adulthood, until 2012. What's missing for me as a person of color is just knowing that there are communities out there. I thought I was the only adult for years, just learning about fire and plants in my backyard, thinking I was the only person in Toronto doing that. I really did. So yeah, just even as a child, and it's not like my parents' fault at all. Like they saw I really like getting dirty and being in nature, but they just didn't know how can I help my child further with this interest in nature. They didn't know where to find that. So I think it's a lack of visibility, just knowing that it exists.
Yeah, and that, you raised you weren't exposed to it based on your parents' experience and it's not their fault. And absolutely, parents always do. I'm firmly convinced that all parents, all caregivers are always doing the very best they can with the skills and the knowledge that they have available to them. I'm completely convinced of that. And so what I have heard from other parents and I mean, from me, who did grow up very much exposed to the outdoors, it was a big part of my life, my whole life, and it's still something that I engage in a lot and preach a lot. My own children are resistant to it, and so parents aren't the only source of motivation around this. But I often think if my children are poo-pooing of going and hanging out outside, parents who are uncomfortable with it themselves, unless the child is really motivated and wants to and leads the way with that. I'm wondering if you have any tips around modeling. You've spoken a number of times about mentorship, and I know that doesn't have to be the parent. And in many cases, a good mentor isn't the parent. And so I'm aware of that. But I also know that kids often, I take heart with my own children because I'm so convinced of the value of modeling, that, the values and the behaviors that I demonstrate to my kids, they're going to integrate that one way or the other. And either they're going to completely reject it and go the opposite way, or they're going to swing back to it and embody it. So I don't feel anxious about that. But for parents and families for whom this is new, for whom this is uncomfortable, I'm wondering if you have any tips or suggestions. How could the family that, is squeaky clean, likes to be inside, doesn't like to take risks, doesn't like to get dirty, what can they do to start dipping their toe into what we've been talking about?
It really helps when a child's parents or the community around them are also interested. And if the parents or the family around the child values the importance of being outside, even like some exposure outside with nature. That's a really great step. Just having that openness to the idea that it can be beneficial to kids to be outside. That's like the first big step, is just that openness. And then even if a family is very hesitant about getting dirty, just start small. Just be curious and approach things in nature with wonder. It could be something not so dirty, like things in the sky that you can just see, like clouds, birds, things, little things that you hear. Just a little bit of curiosity, I think, can go a long way.
That's really, really beautiful. I love that. As we bring our conversation to a close, we're circling back around to that idea of wonder and curiosity. And that's such a piece in our culture that we tend to overlook the value of that. We're so much about wanting to know and have the answers, and the internet's always there, and we can always look things up, which is a beautiful thing in terms of research. But that idea of just releasing the need to have answers and be curious and experience of awe of the world around us is such a lovely, lovely thing.
You don't have to know the name of everything or to identify anything. Sometimes that actually signifies the end of someone's learning. If sometimes people feel, if I know
Wow.
that bird is a red-winged blackbird, I no longer need to know anything about it. And that kind of is a shame, because then there's so much more you can learn about creatures than just their name. So extending that curiosity is actually could be really beneficial in the learning process and building connection with things in nature. I just thought of one other thing families could do if they would like to encourage their child to go outside, especially if they're young. For example, if there's a rainy day and you know you're sending your child off to an outdoor program, an outdoor school, or an outdoor camp, I would really love if the family could try not to say to their child, "I can pick you up if it rains." Because if you say that, then the child will it sets the tone for what their attitude will be like for the rest of the day. Will they embrace the rain or fear the rain and want to go home because of it?
Beautiful. Well, Eileen, thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to say? We've talked about a lot.
I do have one story that really strikes me as, I think, one of the most impactful stories I've experienced with a child in nature. And it's just because the impact of being outside on this child was so great in such a short amount of time that I feel like I really need to share it. It's about a 10-year-old boy named Sam that I mentored for just a season, so 10 weeks in the spring. And when he first started with me outside, he was very reticent of nature. We would do something called sit spots every week. And that's basically a time where you go into the forest. You have your own space away from other people and take in everything that's around you. And so when we ask all of the children to go to find a spot for their sit spot, Sam, he would not step into anywhere but the lawn mowed grass, and he would just stay on the picnic table for his sit spot out in the middle of the field. 2 weeks later, his guardian would tell me about how she noticed such a big change in him in school. It's an indoor school, like mainstream school. And she would say how Sam has become so much more confident in school and so much more excited and participates more. And then fast forward now to the end of the spring. At the end of the spring, we do something called blindfolded drum stock. Kids have their eyes covered, whether it's a blindfold or a hat or their shirt, and all they can do is listen to the sound of a beating drum, and they must follow or go towards that sound without their sight. Sometimes you're having to climb over logs, for example, or go through tall grasses or navigate around trees. And I was so proud of Sam, because to see Sam do this, starting from in the woods and walking through the tall grasses with his blindfold, as opposed to when he would never even step into anything but the lawn mowed grass and he was blindfolded, just totally comfortable going through the bush, was such an amazing change to see in this one person.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that story.
Thank you, Leslie. Thanks for having me and letting me share all these stories.
So if you listen to podcasts or watch YouTube, you've probably heard it 1,000 times before. The plea to subscribe and leave a review or a comment. Well, here we are again. But seriously, the review is especially important to us, as it has a huge impact on our discoverability amongst the zillions of podcasts all competing for your attention. So please consider leaving a review. And heck, we'd really love to hear your feedback. This pilot episode of the EcoParent Podcast Network was made possible with the generous support of Ontario Creates. Thanks for listening.